with the dependence on China, it was mostly raw materials and also on downstream manufactured goods. Well, the last 10 years, the downstream has come down, the upstream has gone up. And China has, in the meantime, used a strategy of denial, as some experts would call it, through export controls by limiting India's access to these raw materials. So India's dependence on China for raw materials is actually severe, and the government is on a war footing and a war path to find alternatives because the export controls are eating into India's success of Make in India.
India, of course, reducing its dependence on China. 14 sectors, I believe, have been identified, and specific industrial policies were launched. Which sectors in India have had the most success when it comes to reducing its dependence on China?
So firstly, it depends on how you define success. If you call the success as downstream supply chains moving into India, I would say mobile phone manufacturing. Apple's iPhone is touted as a big success story. About 20 to 25% of iPhones are now manufactured in India. But that's only one part of the story, right? So the other part is all the inputs that go into the iPhones are still made in China.
When you look at Apple's production in China, it's a huge entire supply chain that's going on business. How much of that complex value chain can India replicate over in its country?
So there are multiple variables here. So one, of course, it's the Taiwanese contract manufacturer. There's then the American Apple iPhone, and then there's the leadership in these countries. So China uses export controls, but then you have policy inconsistency in Washington. A couple of years ago, friendshoring was a thing, but now onshoring is the new thing in Washington. So if President Trump were to change this policy of diversifying supply chains, moving supply chains out of China into not India, but into the U.S., then the entire process is slowed down. So these policy uncertainties and these supply chain diversification initiatives becoming part of trade negotiations make the process even more slower.
When it comes to manufacturing, do you think India has cultivated a workforce that is ready for manufacturing? I mean, there's a lot of debate about this issue.
That's true. India has challenges in workforce development when it comes to manufacturing. India has, over the last 2 decades, built a workforce for the service sector, for its IT and software development. But when it comes to manufacturing, it is still relying on foreign experts to train their local talent, which once again has become a challenge with many countries posing visa restrictions on their experts to travel to India.
What's next for New Delhi? On the one hand, it's trying to reduce its dependence on China, but on the other hand, we're hearing talk that New Delhi is actually opening up dialogue and engagement for foreign direct investment coming from China.
That is true. I think New Delhi is realizing or learning a bitter lesson that China is is in the top of the pyramid when it comes to the hierarchy of value chains. China has mastered manufacturing both upstream and downstream, and also has the experts to train its workforce. So over the last 7 or 8 months, New Delhi has been making inroads in terms of getting access to critical technology from China, and also making peace on the political front. Most recently, they had the Kailash Manasarovar pilgrimage open up to Indian tourists.
And also, what does this mean in terms of negotiating closer ties? At the same time, India, we know, is negotiating closer ties with India. This kind of runs counter to what's happening on the foreign policy front, because we know US and China are at loggerheads right now.
So India, ever since the Bandung conference back in the day, when the Cold War was at its peak, has mastered non-alignment. In the 21st century, it calls it multi-alignment, and it has good relations with Russia, with the US, and it is trying to reset ties with China. Because let's face it, India has many challenges domestically, so India has to make friends and cannot be political or ideological when it comes to making partnerships.
Where do you see government policy heading next?
So the government policy, the next step would be, natural step would be to reduce reliance on China, but also build or cultivate the homegrown talent, whether it's the upstream manufacturing or also having partnerships with countries that can provide the alternatives to China, particularly in the raw material space. So we see that happening a tad bit, I would say, with raw materials and critical minerals. Indian government is finally waking up to the fact that critical minerals are the most controlled export of China's, and India has to tap into its reserves. India is the top 10 when it comes to critical mineral reserves, but it does not, exploit it. So it is beginning to look at it. So I think that's the one good way to approach the challenge.